with our theme, seeing opportunity in devastation with stories to inspire. Now, every week it has been, for the while now, been talking to us about, identifying and staying in a seller's market. Last time, we spoke about what happens when you hit rock bottom and what do you need to do. And one of the things that we spoke about is to recognize that you've hit rock bottom. So once you've realized that, there are several tips that Ed shared in terms of then pivoting in from a buyer's market where you hit rock bottom into a seller's market. Now, obviously, what we spoke about is how do you get into a seller's market, and then most importantly, how to stay there. And I'm going to hand over to you, Ed, and you take it from there.
Thank you, Jacques. Yeah, we've been talking about this a couple of times, and I tweeted today. What do pumpkins have to do with making a success out of your business?
Oh, intriguing!
And yeah, I got some strange comments back on the Twitter line, but actually quite a lot, because there is an absolutely wonderful illustration of how pumpkins made someone get out of a buyer's market and become the leader in their field, in fact, in their country, um, the best known, the best liked in their country. And it all came out of a devastating circumstances which happened in Sri Lanka in about 2017, when Sri Lanka had a bumper pumpkin crop. They grow a lot of vegetables in Sri Lanka. Much of the population is vegan, and that year was an ideal year for pumpkins. And all the pumpkin farmers had huge bumper crops, record crops that they'd never had before. And everyone thought, wow, fantastic, we are going to make so much money now. But pumpkins in Sri Lanka were just consumed internally. There was no export market. So they weren't a very big producer of pumpkins. And the export and the local market was very soon saturated. And the prices fell dramatically on the markets, and they fell in the retail stores, and the market reached saturation. But still, more and more pumpkins ripened and were ready for market. And some pumpkin farmers had mountains of pumpkins that they actually couldn't sell, where it would cost them more to take the pumpkins to market than they would get in selling the pumpkins. Retailers didn't want to buy any more pumpkins. They were overstocked with pumpkins. People were sick of pumpkins. So many of the pumpkin farmers were facing financial ruin, where an entire crop would have to be plowed back in or crushed for animal feed or whatever. A devastating circumstance. And I've seen photographs of pumpkin farmers standing next to mountains, house sized mountains of pumpkins that they couldn't sell. And out of this devastation, a very, very smart retailer, just a retail chain, said, made a very bold announcement. They said, we will buy all the pumpkins that you can supply at and they named a very fair price for pumpkins. Now, that was a bold step because they were going to be buying stuff which was unsaleable. And then they started a mass marketing campaign to increase the consumption of pumpkins. So they scoured the world for recipes for pumpkins. And they created soups and desserts and preserves and tasty dishes, and they published recipe books, and they used to publish every day a recipe of the day, and went very strongly on the thing that it was now patriotic to consume pumpkins. I'm glad I wasn't there. I hate pumpkin. But they actually got it to the point where if you were in a market, in a food store, and you were leaving the food store without a pumpkin, you would get frowned at. It became a patriotic duty to consume pumpkins. And the huge mountain of pumpkins slowly dissipated over time until there was actually a shortage of pumpkins. But in that time, can you imagine what happened to the retailer?
Pray tell.
Anyone who talked retail talked about them. They were the heroes. They saved the farmers. The farmers would walk kilometers past a competitor's store to shop in one of their stores because those were the ones who'd saved the farmers. Many consumers switched their buying pattern completely to that store. The store became the leading light and became the go-to store for food for years after that time. Now, they'd taken a terrible risk because they could have gone insolvent. They said they would buy unsaleable items at a fair market price. And what they had to do was to create the demand for that item. And they broke it up into the different sectors of what they had to do. There were different challenges. First of all, they had to get the farmers believing that if they delivered their pumpkins there, they'd get the right price. Secondly, they had to create the demand. Thirdly, they had to be able to supply the demand, which was a huge logistics problem. And fourthly, they were dealing with perishable goods. Pumpkins don't last forever. So they broke it up into all the individual groups, and they took the deep breath and they took the decision to go ahead. And wow, did it succeed beyond their wildest dreams. They became far and away the leading food retailer in the whole of Sri Lanka, and still are today. Now, this is a perfect example of how you can start by looking at a crisis and say, oh, those poor guys. Yeah, we've got enough pumpkins. We don't need to look at that and move on to the next thing. Or you can look at that and say, there's chaos there, there's devastation there. Is there an opportunity in that devastation? And sure, they saw the opportunity in the devastation. And they managed to do something about it. They had the foresight and the creativity and the ability to follow through and the boldness to actually do something about that. And guess what? They got rich. They got many, many more customers. They opened dozens of extra stores. They became a household name. How much more could you ask for from one simple action coming out of a devastating set of circumstances? Not for them, but for the farmers. Interesting illustration, isn't it?
It's actually I got a question for you, Ed. I know you still want to speak, but just now, it's what occurs to me is in their research. In actual fact, they had no research, they had no reference, they had no track record. This was not what Sri Lanka typically was familiar with. And
Yeah.
this business was not familiar with this. There was absolutely no blueprint to follow, and yet they embarked on this strategy. And this is what's really captivating my attention, Ed.
They wrote the blueprint. They drew the blueprint of how to manage an unmanageable circumstance, of how to create opportunity in devastation.
I like that.
Isn't it lovely? Yeah. It was
It's
one of two
absolutely lovely.
stories. It was one of two stories that I heard when I attended the World Marketing Congress um, back in 2019 or end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And they were two stories which really, really spoke to me in terms of marketing smarts, in terms of, again, how do you take something that there is no blueprint, there's no research, you can't buy a textbook on how to do this. You can't even buy a biography where someone says, well, I did this and this is what worked and this is what didn't work. You have to blue sky it from nowhere and do your own thing through it. Now, that's very bold, very adventurous, very, very big as well, because we're talking about millions and millions and millions of rupees that they spent on pumpkins. And, it could have cost them their business fairly easily and their reputation. If their customers had simply said, we don't want to have pumpkins rammed down our throats, we'll go elsewhere. So they took very large risks, but very calculated risks that the people of Sri Lanka are basically very proud of their nationality and very, very supportive of their people. So they took that as a calculated risk and they won. And that's all they had to go on. That the people of Sri Lanka would rise up and support other Sri Lankans in this kind of crisis. Yeah, great story.
It is, Ed, and just before we move on, you said that it became like a patriotic duty to buy and consume pumpkin
Yes.
products, food, derivative products, and so their marketing message or their sales message must have been spot on to generate that kind of a patriotism, you know, in pumpkins of all things.
Mm. Yeah, well, of course, they focused on the plight of the farmers.
Mm.
That if you didn't do this, you were actually starving a farmer.
Mm.
Um, and next year, that farmer wouldn't be there. So there wouldn't be pumpkins next year. And yes, they used photos of these farmers with no food but mountains of pumpkins, because they couldn't sell their pumpkins. They used a lot of tear jerk imagery to persuade, but they did a twofold marketing strategy. The one was, the patriotic duty, and the other
Hmm.
one was just how tasty you could make pumpkins, because they published recipes that people had never heard of, never dreamed of. How to make pumpkin ice cream and things that you would never have thought of, and they made very, very tasty dishes.
Wow, huge innovation.
Yeah, massive innovation from a relatively small country and surely not sort of known as the high tech leader in world marketing, but a great illustration there.
Thank you, Ed.
Interestingly, interestingly, during the same conference, I heard of another illustration which was a very, very similar situation.
Mm-hmm.
And this didn't concern pumpkins, it concerned an aircraft carrier. So we're moving from pumpkins to aircraft carriers.
I love the diversity.
So in this particular case, India's Navy's flagship was a World War II vintage aircraft carrier, which had now come to its end of life. It had been refitted enough times. It couldn't really now be modernized to take in the modern era. It was an old, old ship, but it had served India well. It had represented their navy in conflict and in peace times, and many, many thousands and thousands of Indians had done their national duty as sailors aboard this aircraft carrier. And it now was almost impossible to maintain, hideously expensive to maintain. It was a total white elephant in the Indian Navy. You needed completely different craft to the sort of craft that they had decided to scrap this aircraft carrier. And there was a huge national outcry, a gigantic. gigantic storm of protest that you couldn't scrap this iconic symbol of India's military, of India's naval might. Um, and the government took a huge amount of flack. There were protests in the streets, and ex sailors formed associations, and it really was a wave of protest of mammoth proportions, um, that India were planning to do this, but they actually didn't have a choice. So they compromised and they said they would put it on permanent moorings and create it as a naval museum, which they did. And that didn't work at all. The wave of protest over this aircraft carrier didn't lead to people frequenting the museum. So, so it stood there and rusted and was just getting worse and worse. And the government eventually took a decision to scrap it. And it created the same kind of outcry, the same kind of patriotic rage against the thought of this magnificent old ship being cut up into parts, to make scrap metal. And a motorcycle manufacturer, a bold motorcycle manufacturer, saw its opportunity out of this national sorrow and bought all the scrap metal from the aircraft carrier. And they used the scrap metal from the aircraft carrier in part to manufacture a range of motorcycles carrying the name of the aircraft carrier. And guess which was the most popular motorcycle in India?
Oh, can't wait. Suspense is killing me, Ed.
Well, of course, this motorcycle just topped the charts everywhere because there was a great patriotism towards that old aircraft. And if you couldn't have the old aircraft carrier sailing around the shore proudly displaying the flag, you could at least ride a motorbike, which was part of it. And they carried on producing those motorbikes with presumably increasingly less and less fractions of the bike actually being a part of the old aircraft carrier for I think about 4 or 5 years. And they became the leading brand motorcycle in India. And once again, someone took a bold move to say we're going to buy a lot of scrap iron which we never use and which must be hideously expensive because the scrap iron from an aircraft carrier is an awful lot of scrap iron, and hope that the motorbike sells. And yes, it did. So once again, out of what was then a national sorrow rather than devastation, a national sense of loss, a bright marketer converted that into a great success story. Now, that happened several years ago, so there's probably not too many of those motorbikes running around anymore, although there may be some. But it was another illustration of how you can step out from the crowd if you keep your eyes open and you think about what options there are to create something out of a bad situation. And the one thing that we don't lack in this world over the last couple of years is bad situations. We have bad situations that we haven't even tried to use yet. We, we have bad situations on every news broadcast that we hear. We have bad situations in every newspaper, if anyone still reads newspapers, but certainly on any one day in the news feeds online or on Twitter or on any of the other channels, TV and the rest, you will have at least one bad news story, one bit of devastation, one bit of chaos, one bit of things that have gone horribly wrong. Why do we simply look at those things and say, I wish that hadn't happened? Or we get numb to them and we turn the channel to find something more pleasant. We shut them away from ourselves. Every one of those represents an opportunity for someone if they have the eyes to see it. Every one of those. But we tend to look away and say, how terrible. Comment about it around the dinner table or wherever we comment on.
Hmm.
And we don't really, as business people, I believe, as often as we should, even if it's just a case study, just a mental exercise, look at a situation and say, where could we, as a business, gain a competitive advantage out of that horrible set of circumstances? We put a challenge out there right now. We have a monster problem in that our entire rail transport system is not functioning. It has been devastated. It has been torn apart. Now that's a massive, massive bit of devastation. Enormous. And we can discuss the whys of it and that sort of thing forevermore, but that's not the purpose. What opportunities are there for even small entrepreneurs right now out of that chaos that's happened? Many entrepreneurs have obviously benefited greatly. The truckers and the taxis, for instance, have benefited greatly out of that chaos. They have switched passes. They've taken the passengers who were formerly on trains and the goods that were formerly on trains, and they're conveying them by road. And once again, that's chaos because the roads are breaking up and the roads are almost unnavigable in some areas because of the volume of trucks. What opportunities are there in that? What other opportunities are there for passengers? What opportunities of privatizing some or all of the railways? What opportunities are there on devastated rail stations? Hopefully, when the rail services start being put back together again. Huge opportunities there, I'm quite sure. I haven't put my mind to it, I have to say, and probably nobody listening has either. But if we just thought about that as a mental exercise and said, what could I achieve by using that devastation and trying to make things better? I'm sure we would come up with some quite creative ideas.
I'm just wanting to maybe give a tidbit of how my brain is being stimulated here, Ed, with this question. Is if from where I look at it is first question I would want to ask is who's mostly impacted
Mm,
by this devastation,
mm.
and so therefore, the if I identify the who and I understand the problem that is being caused, let me go solve that problem.
A very similar one, Jacques, is this gigantic unemployment problem we have
Mm.
in this country, and how people who don't have a tertiary education find it extraordinarily difficult to find employment at all, at any level of reasonable pay and conditions. And you and the foundation that you've started and which I've been involved in, has seen that chaos and seen an opportunity there and started that highly successful intern program, which has produced some brilliant graduates of that program that are really star people. So there's someone who has, well, not for commercial gain, but just for social uh, conscience, has produced a solution to a very, very, or part solution at least, to a very, very large problem. And even tiny parts of a solution are those parts of a solution. It means that there's something that's not getting worse, but getting marginally better.
Hmm. That is just hugely supportive, and you know, uh, Thank you, Ed.
Mm. Yeah, I know, it's awesome stuff. There
And
is, I think it's also in India. There was an individual who looked at the litter on the beaches, and the beaches are just knee deep in litter right across the whole coastline of India. And he couldn't stand this, and he said, "What can one man on his own do?" So he went and cleared a couple of yards or a couple of meters of the beach himself, packed it away, and took it off to a dump. And that one action, which took him one entire weekend to clear about 2 meters of the beach and dispose of the litter, that one action started a movement that cleared 1,000 kilometers of Indian beaches of litter. Small beginnings can often end up with huge outcomes. If you
that
see the
is,
opportunity in the devastation.
wow, Ed. That on that very profound note. I mean, it's actually where I would encourage our listeners just to pause long enough. Small beginnings can lead to very, very profound, impactful outcomes. Don't often look for a blueprint that exists to follow. What did you say? Create and make your own blueprint.
Yeah, draw it.
And sorry, draw your own blueprint more accurately. And have the confidence and the boldness to step out in faith and try. The very act of trying shifts you from one place into a more positive place where you've learned something just because you stepped out and decided to put your creativity into action.
Yeah, correct. Well summarized.
So, as usual, Ed, thank you for sharing. I've got a lot to think about. To me, I'm taking it as homework, and anybody listening, take it as homework. Once again, the encouragement is if you are inspired, take action,
Yeah,
see the result, and then join us live and share your stories with us.
please, we'd love that.
All right, and everybody else that has joined us, thank you for joining us, and until next week.